Good evening and welcome. My name is Cindy Bloom-Leahy and I'm Director of Library Information Services at the Norwalk Public Library. Yes, you're here at the Westport Public Library. But today's program is a wonderful partnership between local libraries. We're so fortunate in Connecticut to have 169 libraries serving in our towns and cities. During 2022, Connecticut libraries hosted 70,448 programs, both in person and virtually, with 1,362,827 people attending these programs. We hope that today's partnership is the birth of many collaborations between our library and our neighbors in programming opportunities. So tonight, we're so happy to present Lisa Belkin, author of Genealogy of a Murder, 4 Generations, 3 Families, One Fateful Night, a compelling, penetrating, tragic story spanning the first half of the 20th century, integrating the lives of 3 individuals, the family trajectories, and the issues and struggles that propel them into a heartbreaking crime in a discussion today with Laurel Peterson. Lisa Belkin is a journalist and author. She's the author of 4 books, Genealogy of a Murder, Life's Work, Confessions of an Unbalanced Mom, First Do No Harm, and Show Me a Hero, the last of which was made into an HBO miniseries of the same name, which won a Golden Globe. While writing most of these books, she is also a reporter at the New York Times, particularly the New York Times Magazine, where her editors described her beat as the social conscience of our times. Her 20-year Times career includes postings as a Texas-based national correspondent, medical reporter, and business writer. She created both the paper's Life's Work column and Motherlode blog. After the Times, Lisa spent several years as a senior correspondent at HuffPost, where she reported and opined about life, work, and family. And then as the senior national correspondent for Yahoo News, covering American social issues. Lisa Belkin was the host of Life's Work with Lisa Belkin at XM Radio, as well as a regular contributor to public radio's The Takeaway and NBC's Today Show. A graduate of Princeton University, she's returned there as a visiting professor teaching narrative nonfiction writing. She currently teaches news reporting, journalistic ethics, and long-form feature writing at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Laurel S. Peterson is a professor of English at Norwalk Community College. Her poetry has been published in many small literary journals. She has 2 poetry chapbooks, That's the Way the Music Sounds and Talking to the Mirror, and a full-length collection of poetry. Do you expect your art to answer you? She's also co-edited a collection of essays on women's justice titled Reinterpretations, The Shapes of Justice in Women's Experience. She's the author of 2 mystery novels, Shadow Notes and The Fallen. Laurel served as the first poet laureate of Norwalk from 2016 to 2019 and developed a following of writers and poets and introduced her students at Norwalk Community College to live readings at the library in a program called Writers and Conversations, which she continues to coordinate and is the moderator. In addition, Laurel has participated in the annual Norwalk Public Library Indian Local Author Celebration for the past 6 years. So please join me in welcoming Laurel Peterson and Lisa Belkin.
It's like you see your children in the wild and you greet them.
Would you like to hold it?
No, that's okay. That's okay.
That's great. Well, I'm really delighted to be here with you this evening.
As am I. It is a thrill
really
to finally
fun.
meet you in person, and I am in love with the Westport Library.
It's a beautiful space.
Incredible.
Yes, absolutely. So, since it's your favorite journalistic question, to get started, let us start there. Take me back to the beginning. How did we get here?
So yes, so that is the introduction to the book, because it was the sort of explanation for why I wrote this whole thing and wrote it forwards. How did I get here? Gravitational pull and accident. So I was supposed to be a lawyer. My mother was a lawyer. And in college, I figured that what you did when you didn't know what you were going to be was you went to law school. So I applied to law school. And I had spent most of my college career, though, working at the school, various school publications and newspapers. So I applied for one journalism job, which was essentially answering the phones for the chief political correspondent of the New York Times at the time. Back when the New York Times had money to hire assistants for their chief political correspondent, those days are over. But at the time, it was an entry-level job that they warned you would only last 1 year, and don't get your hopes up. I got it, and so I had gotten into law school. I had sent the University of Virginia a deposit. I had found a roommate, and I was ready to go to law school when I got this one-year job. So I called the University of Virginia and said, can I defer for a year? And they said, yes, but you can't have your $100 deposit back. And I said, no, I understand, but I'll see you next year. And within a year, I was hooked, and it was sort of an internal Times program where you did get to answer the phones during the day and write in your spare time and elbow each other out of the way for some sort of permanent position, which is what it turned out I got. It's really the only place I worked for the first 30 years of my career, which is, again, a previous era. It couldn't happen now. But so when I was entrenched at the Times, I wrote to UVA, because you wrote letters and made phone calls then, and I said, well, I think I'm not coming. And they said, okay, but you can't have your $100 back. I said, no, we've been through that, I know. So after what would have been my first year at the time, what would have been my first year at UVA, I got a letter from them saying, you owe us $100, and if you don't pay, then you can't register for your second year. Oh. After what would have been my second year, I got the same letter about third year, and after what would have been my third year, I got a letter saying, you owe us $100, and unless you pay, we will withhold your diploma. And it's both a measure of how little money I was making and how journalism has changed, that I didn't just send them $100 and see what happened. Not the diploma. I didn't really think they were going to give me one. I wanted my transcript. I wanted to know how I did. So, and it also never occurred to me to write about it. So think about the difference in journalism from then till now. It never occurred to me that this is a great essay that I could place in some, online publication. I mean, isn't it a great essay? It would be a great essay. But there was no first person, there were no places to place, there was no online. It was a completely different world. So there's my origins in journalism were like this blip that today would have sort of been a moment for me. I could have gone viral on this one, but there was no viral at the time. So yeah, so those were the beginnings. So it was truly gravitational pull. I belonged to the school newspaper in high school, which meant I joined the school newspaper in college, and might have dated the editor of the school newspaper in college, and so those were the things I knew how to do. And then suddenly it was the only thing I knew how to do, and I found somebody to pay me to do it. Not the best life advice for an average graduate. Don't listen, kids. But that's where I started.
Yeah, that's a wonderful story. I am very sorry to hear that Alvin Tarlov died just in the last week or so, yes?
Yes, so just to go back a little for whoever does not know the backstory or been following along on social media, the story is about 3 families. It began with a story told to be by my stepfather, Alvin Tarlov, and his was one of those families. And it was about how these 3 men's lives collided one night in 1960 with the murder of a police officer. So it was, how does one grandson of immigrants become a police officer, one become his killer, and one become my stepfather, who inadvertently set this shooting into motion. And Al told me this story, and for 9 years, I researched it. I went back 100 years. I went down various rabbit holes, all of it sort of piecing together, how do any of us become who we are, and what are all the things that have to happen in order for this one thing to happen. And at the beginning, Al was my best source. Every one of his, whatever he told me, and he told me the story in 2014 about an event that happened in 1960. He was already in his 80s when he told it to me, and every checkable fact checked out. It was remarkable, this man's memory. But I watched that memory fade. I had an agonizing perspective on, when I asked him this 3 years ago, he gave me 5 pages, and I asked him the same question now, which is, a way I research. Let's see what other details come out in a retelling. And he had nothing. And so, in a way, Al's story is in this book, and it would not exist if he had not told it to me. And I sort of watched him fade away. And then COVID got him. And the pub date of the book, this is a book about all the coincidences and choices and bits of chance that led to the cataclysmic collision of these 3 lives. And this bit of, coincidence that if I were writing fiction, my editor would have thrown the thing out. The pub date for the book was the day of Al's funeral. Oh. So it takes on a very bittersweet feeling to be talking about it. On the other hand, he gave me a story, and he said, go tell it. And so I'm telling it as best I can.
Yeah, that was quite a gift in both directions, actually. There are so many threads in this story.
Just a few.
Just a few. So she talks about 4 different families. You can correct my pronunciation, please. The Cosentinos, the Tarlovs, the Dilsalvos, and the Troys. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about each family and their role.
Sure. Well, first I want to introduce you to 2 people. So the officer who died was David Troy, and we'll start with the Troy family. And he had 3 children the night he died. And Doreen was 4, Diane was 3, David was 6 months. And Doreen and Diane are here with us tonight, and I just wanted to welcome them. They are no longer 4 years old and 3 years old, but in many other ways exactly the same. So the Troy family was from Ireland, and Bridget Troy came, Bridget Riley came and married Charles Troy in 1920. And both of them, all these families, I could say the exact same sentence about all 4 families. They came over because life was better here and they wanted a better life for their children, or they were children who were sent, in the case of Bridget Riley Troy, by parents back in Ireland who wanted a better life for her. And Joseph DeSalvo's family was from Italy, and a huge, huge sprawling family, of which Joseph's father was sort of the black sheep, the one who couldn't quite make it, the one who, circumstance and maybe genetics and just seemed to work against no matter which direction he turned. Alvin Tarlov's was a Jewish family right on the Polish-Russian border, depending on what day of the week it was. And his grandfather was he was a horse broker or breaker. He basically was Avis in Norwalk in the 1880s. He would go out to the plains of Montana, find horses that, he had a knack for selecting the ones that could be tamed, bring them back by train to Norwalk, to South Norwalk. And there's a Tarlov Street, actually, in Norwalk. And teach them to pull buggies. And then if your family didn't own one, you could rent one from the Tarlovs. So those were the origins of the Tarlovs here in Norwalk. And Max, that grandfather, died young and led to a sort of cascade of events that led to Al becoming the doctor that he becomes in the end of the story. And then there were the Cosentinos, who, it says 4 generations, 3 families, and yet I'm telling you about 4 of them, because math has never been my strong suit, and, and because we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what to put on the cover. But in fact, Rose Cosentino was David Troy's wife. And her family history was just as significant into how did she become who she became in order to marry into this Troy family. So there are 4 of them. And, the shortest version of the story is Al was a physician in the Army. He was 30 years old and in 1960, and he was stationed at the Stateville Penitentiary in Chicago. And he was running experiments on prisoners, which would later be determined by Congress to be highly unethical. And there are bans on it since, I think, 1973. But it was being done by the Army in order to find a cure for malaria, which was a huge national priority at the time because it was crippling American troops. It sidelined them in World War II, it devastated them in Korea, and now we were facing Vietnam, and they still had not found a way to keep troops healthy. So Al was running these experiments on prisoners, and one of the lab techs, who was both a volunteer in the experiment and a trainee of Al's in the lab, was this guy, Joe DeSalvo, who had his own life story, which you will read by the time they all meet at the Stateville Penitentiary. And Al trained him to do a job that was supposed to rehabilitate him and send him off into the world, a changed man. And Al did the best he could, making the best choices that he could with the best knowledge at the time as to how does one change. And Joe did really well for a while, and then not well at all. And everything went terribly wrong, and David Troy died. So it's a look at the past for hints of how the future becomes what it is, whether it's inevitable. And sort of these 3 guys who could be I could write this book about any of you, right? Any 3 people. Probably wouldn't be a murder, but
Yet.
But how did you and I come to be sitting on this stage could be a book that is essentially the history of the United States. Yeah. And so that's what I did, and it took 9 years.
Wow. Well, it is comprehensive. Yes.
Ooh, that's a good one. I should have used that with my editor when he was cutting 70,000 words.
Oh. Right? Okay. The through line, it seems to me, in the text, in your stepfather's work, is, which is quoted on page 356, is how non-medical factors determine an individual's physical and psychological health. I'm interested, especially based on what you just said, if you have come away from the book with a sense of whether or not these people were determined by their past, or whether they were making free choices. Like, this is the impossible question to answer, right?
And yet I wrote 412 pages about it.
Yeah.
No, I mean, that is the question. So did each of these men become who they were in spite of everything or because of everything? And it's the question we all have about our own lives. It is the nature-nurture question. It is the is there a God question. It is the question that, I'm hardly the first person to write a book about. And for a while, I was deeply troubled by the thought that I don't like the moral of my own story. Because you have a murderer who had a horrible backstory. You arguably never had a chance, right? Going back to things that happened to his father, and epigenetics, if you want to use it in the scientific term, the sins of the father, if you want to be religious or philosophical about it. But this man didn't have a chance in so many ways. And so is that going to be the moral of my entire book, is some people are just broken and some people can't be saved, and some men used writ large, some people can't change. And I don't believe that. And yet I found myself writing a book about this broken man who caused chaos because of things that happened to him before he was even born. And that's why there are 4 families in the book, because the Cosentino family, their mother's family, was also arguably broken and had few choices, and was, a poor Italian family living in North Miamis. A father who walked out, after years of abuse and drinking, he finally left. Kids who got in trouble and were truant and then joined the army and went AWOL and were as bad an actor and had as bad a start as my shooter. And yet, Dante Cosentino, their uncle, is a philosophy professor in California, right? So you could have a bad start, and then what made the difference? And by the description of, well, Dante, but everyone in the book, the people who got out of trouble, who pulled themselves up, were people who someone stepped in and cared. There's, in each of those stories, there's an external somebody who says, no, you're better than this, and here, I want to help you. When it came early, it worked. When it came too late, it didn't. Al tried to be that person for Joseph DeSalvo, but they were 30 years old by then. So I decided that was the moral of the story, that we all need to be better to each other earlier on, because it can, in fact, make a difference.
Okay. You write at the end of the book that John James DeSalvo's lawyer sums up that he had, quote, suffered from a deep-rooted, deep-seated character neurosis, end quote, since 8 years old. He had high intelligence, lack of experience with normal social interactions. He mimicked rather than understanding how you should be with another person. He studied attempts to show emotion, and thus his attempts to kill himself were his way of destroying the beast that he was within, the doctor concluded. I'm curious what you think of that evaluation based on what you've said.
Yeah, so first of all, people throw around psychological jargon a lot in this book, and what's really interesting is how little we know, right? So you go back to, spoiler alert, Leopold and Loeb play a direct role in this book, and there is a through line between, Nathan Leopold and whether or not this murder may or may not have happened if things had gone differently. And so starting with the Leopold and Loeb trial, it became a thing to try and figure out what was going on in the heads of people who did bad things. And I started reading about it in the 1920s, and I've read about it through certainly the 1960s for this book and through till today, and we have no idea is the answer. We're trying. We have far more information than we did, but that sentence that his lawyer announced that he had a deep-seated neurosis from the age of 8, how did his lawyer know that? His lawyer did not know that. But we feel like there must be some explanation in here if only we could figure it out. And so we have been trying to figure it out for millennia. Whether or not he was trying to kill the beast inside, I think he may have been onto something. I think, and again, I don't want to sort of sit here and give you the entire plot of the book, which you should read for yourself.
Yes, you should.
And I don't want to give you the ending, but trying to kill the beast kind of gives you a hint at the ending. In the end, I think DeSalvo concluded for himself that this was all he was, and he was damaged goods, and he could not function in society. It speaks a lot to prison reform in addition to psychology, which the book is also very much about. Al used to sum it up as, so they take a guy who can't make it out in the world, and they put him away from the world for years to decades, and then they stick him back into the world, and they're surprised when he doesn't do any better than he did the last time.
Yeah.
And it is a commentary on all of prison reform. And we've gone through the pendulum, and the pendulum is in the book, where, sometimes we say, okay, rehabilitation and training programs, and we're gonna, give everybody a chance. And sometimes it's no, they need to be punished. It needs to be made clear that this will not be tolerated in a civilized society. And we've gone back and forth since prisons began, before there was a United States of America, and it's gone back and forth before that in Europe, and it's never landed anywhere because it never fully works. I hesitate to speak beyond 1960 because that is what I know intimately. I have spent some time looking at how it works now just to answer the question. And what seems to make the biggest difference are the programs that do, in fact, prepare you to go back into the world. They're expensive, they're time intensive, they are not necessarily popular in certain parts of the country that don't want to fund them, but there are step-down programs within prisons where you are slowly living more and more independently, and once you get out, you have scaffolding to support you. That was what DeSalvo was looking to my stepfather for. He represented the structure of prison life, where every day they did the same thing together and they knew what was expected of them. And then when DeSalvo was released, with Al's help, Al got him the things that are supposed to work, right? A job, a place to live, and getting out of the water you swim in. And so to bring this, to the neighborhood, Al got Joe a job at the Norwalk Hospital and a place to live in Norwalk, Connecticut, because that's where Al was raised. And that got him out of Chicago, which is where all his crimes were committed. And so Joe at one point called Al and said, I need to see you, when he knew that Al was here in Norwalk on vacation, and Al could not see him. And that, to me, is sort of the inflection point. That's the pivotal moment in this book that sort of made the whole shooting inevitable, because I think this guy was saying, I need a reminder of when I could function. And you are all I've got, so I need you to be my person. And Al couldn't do it, and Joe went and bought a gun. So I don't have the world's most sophisticated knowledge of prison reform and what works and what doesn't. Nobody does. Nobody has been able to fix it. But I am fixated on, if you aren't there for people after they leave, you can't expect a different ending. What is it? Insanity is doing the same thing and expecting it to turn out differently. Right. You cannot expect a different ending.
It seems to me that a number of the institutions in the book fail the people they're trying to help. From Statesville to the farm in Norwich, where Jerome tried to dry out, the school for boys in Chicago, where Joe was sent as a minor. None of them were particularly effective in doing what they were supposed to do.
Yeah, you know, the Stateville, what she's mentioning, the Stateville Penitentiary was the prison in Chicago. The Norwich Farm was right after Prohibition, actually, where they sent people to detox, and they closed it because after 20 years, they did a big report that said, really, we haven't been doing any good for anybody. We don't know what works to help an alcoholic. The Stateville School for Boys, I found fascinating writing that history. DeSalvo was sent there as a 14-year-old to, you know, back when juvenile delinquency became a term. And if you map the people who ran it, the wardens of that particular institution, it went from, hey, we're all Boy Scouts, to, hey, we're the military, to, you know, you guys are all the future, we just need to, you know, teach you and make you confident and proud of yourselves, to, you are all losers and the scum of the earth. I mean, depending on when a boy, and they were boys, were sent to this place, they had a completely different rehabilitative experience. And that's kind of the history of the US trying to figure out an answer. And you're right. I mean, I never really looked at it that way before, but there is no major institution that really comes through in this whole book.
Yeah.
I wrote a depressing book.
An interesting book, a challenging book, a book that challenges us. And in fact, what questions do you think are important? Because I am guessing that this is part of your intention, are important for citizens and legislators to ask about our prison systems and institutions.
I think for starts, they can't be one size fits all, right? So there are some people for whom nothing will work. I think that is true. I think there are some people for whom nothing will work. I think there are some people who are desperate to be educated, to be helped with change. I think right now, and again, this is, I keep coming back to, this is a snapshot of a moment, and the moment is 1960. The prisons were not yet almost entirely black, right? The fights were between the Irish gangs and the Italian gangs. The racial makeup echoed that of the country. Nixon had not started using prisons as part of, you know, a weapon in the drug war and locking up people in the inner cities because to prove some sort of larger point. So what message you come across, and that is a fascinating historical fact, to look at a prison system and not be talking about race was, I mean, I kept making sure I was right.
Yeah.
Because I didn't want to be missing something, but race was not the issue in the American penal system. It was not good to be a black man in a prison, but it was not the default. It was not the purpose, which it became, certainly during the 1960s, during the race riots of the 60s. So now it's much more of a mental health question than it necessarily was back then. It was easier back then, and they couldn't figure it out then. But I still think it can't be one size fits all, and I think that there has to be some sort of, everything that has happened in prison since 1960 has made it harder once you've gotten out, not easier. You are not allowed to live certain places. You are not, it is okay to not hire you because of a prison record. That's changing in some places. We have made it tougher to do all the things you need to do to survive out here. Then again, I don't want to make myself the expert on prison reform in 2023 when, I don't know. I have not spent the time.
Fair enough. So you spend a fair amount of time in the book talking about, as you mentioned before, Nathan Leopold.
Nathan Leopold.
Yes.
Okay, let me do a poll of the audience, though I'm pretty sure just based, you know, I'll then tell you what my previous polls of such audiences have found. Nathan Leopold. Who knows Nathan Leopold? The Leopold and Loeb story. Raise of hands. Okay, who does not? Raise of hands. Interesting. I've asked that question a lot to groups of people over the years. Wait, let me ask the third one. 2 University of Chicago students who murdered a teenager just to prove that they could, and they were so smart they could get away with it. Does that mean anything to anyone? So some of these hands that weren't going up are going up now. Yeah, that's what usually happens. Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb were both teenagers in 1924. They were brilliant objectively. They were college students when they should have still been in high school. They were also extraordinarily wealthy. They were sons of unbelievably wealthy families in Chicago. And they kind of had everything. And they decided that they were so brilliant that they could get away with murder and not get caught. And so they committed one. And it became the crime of the century. There'd already been about 5 crimes of the century by 1924, and there were many other crimes of the century. One of the things that happened in the 1900s is we started calling everything the crime of the century. But it was huge. It was everywhere. There was no one in the United States who did not know about this particular crime, and they were notorious, and they ended up at spoiler alert, they were not smart enough to get away with murder and not get caught. They got caught pretty quickly and pretty easily because of their own stupid mistakes. But they were at the Stateville Penitentiary, and they were sentenced to 99 years to life. And they had a lot of time on their hands. So they started playing a game of sorts, which was they would watch people leave on parole. Parole was a relatively new concept in the 1920s. And they would watch people leave, and they would take bets with each other, these 2 murderers, as to who was going to come back and who was going to make good. And they were right a large percentage of the time. Pretty proud of themselves because they still thought they were really brilliant and cool. And I have no great love for Nathan Leopold, by the way. I spent a lot of time in his head, and he was an arrogant young man, but he was in fact brilliant. And he started to codify his thinking, right? Okay, we think so-and-so is going to make good. Why? And they would list the reasons. And then eventually they had a list of about 1,500 reasons, and they made that into a questionnaire, and they made that questionnaire into something called a parole prediction report, right? We are going, the holy grail of sociology, which was also brand new in the 1920s, was how do you predict crime? How do you predict who is going to get better when once locked up and rehabilitated? And they started writing about this in sociology journals of the time under a presumed name, because you couldn't have a notorious murderer writing articles for a sociology journal. And the instrument that they created, mostly Leopold, Loeb died young in 1933. He was murdered in the shower. But what they created became the instrument that's the Stateville Penitentiary and then the greater state of Illinois, and then much of the country used to determine parole eligibility. And it was what my stepfather used to determine or to help him decide whether or not Joseph DeSalvo was a good parole risk. And so there was a lot about writing this book where I kept having the same moment of, oh my God, they were real, right? You know, I'm sort of living with these old stories, and then I would get a document or a photo or meet a person, and realizing, you know, finding Joseph DeSalvo's parole prediction report, realizing that this Leopold guy who I'd been hearing about since high school, you know, was actually, I didn't have to contort, I didn't have to stretch. It was like this story that these people had just been sitting there waiting for me to put the pieces together in the way that if you look back on any of your lives, there are those same pieces. They all fit perfectly. They're all totally linear looking backwards. And here was this figure in history who had You could argue, I do, that if 14-year-old Bobby Franks hadn't been killed in 1924, then your dad may well not have died in 1960, which is so true of the entire web that we are all a part of, but we never see it. We don't look at it. It's sort of like, this hidden, what I'm now trying to remember the name of the musical where the town appears once every, it's Brigadoon. It's this place that exists. We are all connected in these ways. These events are all connected in these ways, and it takes a crazy writer who spends 9 years to see it. And I'm not sure I answered your question because I went really far afield there. But yes, Nathan Leopold. Nathan Leopold was actually, a character in this book. I did not know that when I wrote the proposal, and yet he just stood up and announced himself. And taught me a lot about how the prison system does and does not work.
You brought up something really interesting from a writing point of view, and that is that you did not like him. And so I am curious how a writer manages characters, because it sounds as though for part of the time they were real and part of the time they were characters for you. How do you manage a character that you don't like?
I didn't want him to win. Nathan Leopold very badly wanted to win the public relations war. And so by I didn't like him, I did not want him to win. So in his particular case, and then I'll answer it more generally because it's a really interesting question. He got the last word, right? Bobby Franks couldn't tell his story. Richard Loeb died 9 years after they were imprisoned. He never got to tell his story. Nathan Leopold worked very, very hard to tell his story. And in his story, he was under the sway of Richard Loeb. He never would have done it but for, this man's charismatic control of him. He was reformed and rehabilitated, and he had learned his lesson. He wrote an autobiography that was timed to his parole, and that's really everything we know about Nathan Leopold's time in prison. So it's a very particular question about him. I just didn't want him to win. I wanted to keep his victim front and center. I wanted to keep remembering that I knew that this was a brilliant way to do parole prediction because Nathan Leopold kept saying it was. So he was one case. But the broader question is interesting. I think more broadly, when you're not talking about a notorious historical, murderer, you shouldn't write about people you may not agree with them. You may think they were wrong. You may think they were misguided. You may think they made poor decisions. You may think even that they had evil tendencies. But you can't think that they weren't somehow trying to do their version of what they thought was right and acceptable. I don't think there is anyone who gets up in the morning and says, I'm going to do something evil today. I am going to be horrible today. I think they have their own warped, but linear reason for doing it. And I think that, as a journalist and now I guess as a historian, the job is to crawl into their heads and figure out what made sense to them. So there are people in this book who do bad things. And I am sympathetic to every single person in it because I think that all of them were trying the best they possibly could.
So maintaining a kind of compassion.
Yeah. I mean, yes, because otherwise, kind of what's the point? Otherwise, they're a caricature. If you're not climbing into their head, then they're just a caricature.
Great. Thank you. I think we need to open it up for audience questions. Is that right?
Well, I think we should give the audience a chance. If you do have any questions for Lisa, please come over here to this microphone. I know it seems very far away, but I promise you this way, people watching from home or watching the recording later will be able to hear your question. And while we're waiting, this has been fascinating. So thank you, Lisa, for bringing this story here.
Wonderful.
Thank you for the invitation. It has been spectacular.
Lisa, thanks for this work, and thanks for coming to Norwalk and Westport to talk about it. I was just wondering, over your career as a journalist, have you gotten any advice that you felt has been very useful as you've done your work, or kept you at a North Star as you've been working through, the details of all your projects?
Interesting question. I don't want to compare myself to Robert Caro. No writer should ever compare themselves to Robert Caro, but he does have the best piece of advice he ever got, he says, is turn every page, right? So if you're looking at a stack of documents, just turn every page. It was very famously advice he got when he was just starting out. And I kind of had my same moment earlier in my own career, which it's the equivalent. I covered medical care for a while, and they call it a doorknob conversation. It was not first explained to me as a doorknob conversation, but the concept works. You're sitting with a doctor, and they ask you all the questions, and then, or as a doctor, you're sitting with a patient, and then you go to leave, and you have your hand on the doorknob, and they say, oh, but one more thing, or oh, by the way. And I think with almost everything I have ever written, the most important moment, the thing I learned the most, the thing that changed the whole direction of the story has been that kind of moment where, so when you're trying to talk to someone about their life, their concerns, their story, you just have to wait past the end of the conversation because that's where you learn the most.
One more beat.
I'm sorry?
One more beat.
One more beat. So yeah, so wait for the doorknob conversation. Just keep listening. Let them finish the story. And it's true of the story that started this book. The book started with my stepdad. He was, I say my stepdad, but I didn't meet the man until I was almost 50. He married my mother when they were in their 70s and 80s. I did not know them well because they moved off to, I didn't know him well, they moved to Arizona. So it was kind of early in our getting to know each other. We were sitting at breakfast in their house in Arizona, and he started to tell me a story, and it was a very long story, a very, very long story. And I almost interrupted him 3 or 4 times, and it was the story that became this book. And had I interrupted him, he may never have actually gotten all the way there, and there may not have been a book. So, yeah, listening. It's not just, it's not a trait. It's what I'm supposed to be doing. That's my job.
Part 2. I'm going to ask a question because we were trained in preceptorials to always have a question. And when I was in graduate school, a fellow professor who was at Princeton said, always have a question. Because I think how can we listen to such a fascinating talk and not conjure different ideas? So my question has to do with, you said it took you 9 years to write this book, which I appreciate and I totally get. But as a reporter, you may have 90 minutes or 9 hours. So, but in both cases, you have to do the same deep dive. So how do you channel that to get to the essence of a story? And also a second part of that actually relates to a question on the podium, especially writing nonfiction novels, of which you've done 2 on family stories. How do you keep the person as a historical figure versus emerging as a character, which was the description? Because once they become a character, they become fiction, I would think. to a large degree. So
Okay.
how do you balance the time, and then how do you control the story to get to that point that you want to make?
Okay, so how long do you have? The first one, you could write 30 words or 30,000 words about anything. So I teach journalism, and the first thing you teach is certain stories have certain purposes. A breaking news story has to be written fast, and it has to be written relatively short, and then you get to come back and fill it in. The goal is to never write anything that you know to be wrong. But that doesn't mean you're always going to be right with that first draft. You can't be. It is not possible. And so some of the coming back and what takes longer and going, over it again and again and diving deeper and giving it context, that's what takes the time. So the essence of a story, the who, what, where, why, when, how, which nobody actually writes journalistically, but which is a great North Star for a shorter piece, that is for a shorter piece. And then you use that to say, okay, where does this lead me? And they're just two different kinds of writing. And I find I like longer. You may have noticed from some of my answers, I go long. That's just what I do. And as far as people becoming characters and then you're writing fiction, I'm not. I am quite sure that there are mistakes in this book. The Norton Legal Department was unhappy when I put that in my acknowledgments because they said, no, you can't knowingly make mistakes, but that's not what I'm saying. There is no human being who doesn't make one, and there are, arguably a gajillion facts in this book. And so there are going to be things I got wrong. There are things I know I have wrong. I now have a list because I ask in my acknowledgments for people to please tell me what I got wrong. So pure fact, I did the best I could, and I will correct as best I can the things I've gotten wrong. What you're talking about is interpretation. Because first of all, there was no movie camera there. And even if there were, it had to have been held by someone and pointed at someone else. It didn't take in, 360. There is absolutely no way to completely and totally know what happened anywhere, ever. The best you can do is what I tried to do, which is make sure that I had a very good reason for reaching the interpretation that I reached, because someone who was there told me, and so I was more or less taking on their point of view, because more than one source document said it. Could they both have been wrong? Yes, but at least I did what was doable to check the fact. And I don't think I let these people become characters. I think I tried very hard to stitch them together out of available fact and then see what happened when that stitched together person stood up and walked around. It's the difference between fiction and nonfiction. And I tried religiously to hew to that line.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Going once, going twice. My hand is on the doorknob. Just making sure. Okay. I would like to thank Lisa and Laurel for a fabulous conversation.
You were amazing.
I'd also like to thank our entire audience this evening for coming out, and the Norwalk Public Library, obviously, for co-producing this event with us. Thank you all so much. We do have copies of Genealogy of a Murder for sale, and those will be right here, and Lisa will sign them for you. So thank you all, and have a wonderful night.